Most people at some point will have experienced the pain of a nettle sting. For my own part, I once managed to fall hands first from a fence into a whole patch of nettles, so it's hardly surprising that people consider them unwanted or unloved plants. Now, the stinging nettle, or common nettle, is Europe's most common nettle, and other names for the plant include burning weed, fireweed, and burning nettle. But as we've seen with other unwanted plants like daffodils and celandine, it still has a part to play. Caterpillars feed on the leaves, including those of tortoiseshell, comma, peacock, and red admiral butterflies. Aphids eat the leaves, which then attracts ladybirds to eat the aphids, and so on. And there's more. It's surprisingly edible and has a wealth of medicinal and magical lore in its spiky back pocket. So let's discover how you can use nettles to ward off witchcraft, boost your iron intake, and even dye fabric in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I hope that you are well and that you're enjoying... Well, I suppose here in the UK, it's like just the back end of the Easter holidays, so I'm a little bit annoyed that I've got to go back to work next week, but never mind. I'd much rather hang out with you. We are continuing with our Folklore of Unwanted Plants month, and I thought we'd do nettles this week. Now, nettles are a funny one because people generally don't like them because they sting, and some people just don't like them because they do form quite large patches. But much like dandelions, they're actually really, really useful. And it was only when I started doing this episode and doing the research, I was like, wow, there's actually so much more to them than I thought there was. So we're going to have a look at various bits and pieces to do with their use in magic, their use in medicinal remedies, and other things that nettles are apparently helpful for. But we can't really go any further without addressing the fact that, yes, nettles hurt in a way that you just don't get from plants like dandelions, which are just lovely. And I think the sting is the main reason why people hate nettles. Now, the sting actually comes from the tiny hairs on its leaves, and when those hairs then get stuck in the skin, they inject histamine, which causes inflammation. And according to Ruth Binney, people thought the hairs were, and I quote, the prongs of the devil's pitchfork, end quote, in Ireland. Now, many people believe that rubbing dock leaves on a nettle sting will help, and this particular remedy appears in Old English texts, and Chaucer even repeats an old charm in Troilus and Cressida in 1386, nettle in, dock out, that you would apparently recite while using the dock leaf. Now, contrary to what a lot of people think, rubbing dock leaves won't necessarily help soothe the stings because science has shown that the sap released by the dock leaves actually does nothing to counteract the chemicals of the nettle sting. That said, researchers did concede that using a dock leaf might still help in some way because of a combination of the rubbing action and the good old-fashioned placebo effect. So if you believe it's going to work, then it might. I personally can't help thinking that you're actually better off just carrying an antihistamine ointment if you're in nettle country. In the UK, I use anthisan, which is also good for insect bites and stings as well. But obviously always check with your GP which cream is the right one for you first. Now, dock leaves themselves are unwanted plants and were actually covered by the 1959 Weeds Act, which meant that landowners had to stop their spread or pay a £1,000 fine. But we're not here for dock leaves, we're here for the nettles. So we're going to go on to some of the uses that nettles actually had. And according to Margaret Baker, people actually used nettle oil before paraffin was invented. The juice of the plants had a range of uses, including curdling milk to create Cheshire cheese, sealing a leaking barrel, and keeping flies away from a larder. She also notes that people added dried nettles to mash to help chickens with their egg production, while nettle compost would boost ailing plants. And packing tomatoes and stone fruit in nettle leaves apparently kept them fresh for longer, which was particularly helpful if you needed to carry them any particular distance. Now, you can actually boil the leaves to create a green dye that apparently stays vibrant on natural fibres, or you can also shred the stalks to make paper, or indeed turn them into fibres so you can weave fabric or spin yarn. So pretty much as far as the plant itself goes, it probably has a wider range of uses than pretty much any of the plants that we've featured on Fabulous Folklore so far, possibly more so even than dandelions. Now, the plant is a good source of magnesium, iron, calcium and vitamins A, B, C and D. Now, many people drink nettle tea, and other people also eat nettle soup, which is a popular way to eat nettles. Nettle pudding is believed to be Britain's oldest pudding, dating to 6000 BC, and people have also made both beer and wine from the plant. Now, the Great British Chef's website recommends handling fresh nettles with gloves and always washing them before you use them, because obviously you might not spray your plants, but you don't know what else has been sprayed onto your plants by animals. And obviously always blanch them in boiling water, because this basically neutralises the sting, and that's when you can then just eat them like regular leaves. And they recommend that you essentially treat them as you would cooked spinach leaves. So if you see cooked spinach in a recipe, you can pretty much swap it out for nettles. Now, nettles also appear in a range of old remedies, although, as always, don't try these at home. Be careful before you start eating or using nettles, and pregnant women shouldn't use it at all. And I would say don't use herbal preparations until you've spoken to your GP, because herbs can sometimes interact with medication, so it's better to be safe than sorry. Now, the ancient Romans deliberately stung themselves with nettles in cold climates to stave off the cold. Basically, when people say that, they essentially mean Britain, because obviously it is quite cold here at times. And clearly any warmth that the nettles generated was actually due to skin inflammation from the sting, not actual body heat. That said, according to Margaret Baker, the Romans recommended nettles to help ease rheumatic joints. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, since rheumatism causes inflammation, and surely you wouldn't want to add more inflammation, but it does seem that where nettles touch painful areas, they actually somehow interfere with pain signals and can therefore reduce pain, according to the Mount Sinai website. So it is entirely possible that they did actually have some kind of use, and the Romans obviously didn't understand necessarily the mechanism behind it, but they understood what they did and the fact that it helped. In the medieval era, people actually believed that you could improve the growth of your hair with nettles, and people would squeeze juice from nettle leaves into a bowl. They would dip their comb's teeth into the juice every morning and then comb their hair the wrong way, and apparently that would then speed up the growth of the hair. I don't necessarily know that that was necessarily anything to do with the nettles, and it may have just been like the extra care and attention may have helped to sort of boost the hair follicle or something. I don't know, but that was quite an interesting one. Medieval Europeans also used nettles as a diuretic, which is quite interesting because here in the 21st century, nettles are often used for a range of symptoms related to urinary problems. The 10th century Lachnunga, which obviously we've dealt with before in the Elf Shot episode, contains an invocation called the 9 Herbs Prayer or 9 Herbs Charm. And SES ably theorises that the reason why you've got a charm that goes with this particular preparation is because reciting the charm essentially helps practitioners time their preparations. Now, alongside nettle, the recipe included mugwort, plantain, shepherd's purse, betony, chamomile, crabapple, chervil and fennel. The plants were boiled, mixed with soap and then made into a salve to treat skin infections. And Julian Walker points to a recipe in Bald's Leech book from a similar era, which was for an ointment to treat muscular pain that contained nettles, as do quite a lot of different preparations now. Finally, in the 16th century, John Gerard recommended baking nettles with sugar in his herbal, and the resulting confection would boost the vital spirits. Now, to be fair, that would also probably taste quite nice. And again, as we've seen, cooking nettles basically makes them edible, so I sort of think that actually sounds rather delicious. Now, Margaret Baker notes that Guernsey fishermen swore by a liniment of nettles, oil and salt, and they rubbed that onto the spine, wrists and soles of the feet. And nettle tea was also a much recommended tonic, and there's actually a rhyme that went with this that says, if they'd eat nettles in March and mugwort in May, so many fine maidens wouldn't go to the clay. So I'm assuming that they're suggesting that eating nettles and mugwort would somehow then stave off death in young women, is what that sounds like to me. Now, to ward off ague, Catherine Oswald prescribed the picking of nettle by its root before sunrise on 3 successive mornings, where Margaret Baker then gives an alternative version, that if a healer pulled up a nettle by its roots and spoke both the patient's name and that of their parents, then they could cure fever. That said, Scottish records from 1884 insisted that no one must speak to the nettle gatherer, and the nettles had to be collected at midnight to retain its medicinal virtues. Now, a respondent on plantlaw.com noted that they dried nettles to turn into a tea infusion to help with cat allergies, and a lot of people said that they'd heard nettle stings helped ease arthritis and rheumatism, although a few people suggested that they actually added nettles to their bath for the condition, and to be fair, that probably sounds like a better way to use it than sort of whipping yourself with nettles, which would probably just hurt after a while. Other people said that steeping nettles in boiling water, straining the mixture, and then pouring over freshly washed hair made an excellent hair conditioner. So that sounds like a pretty easy way to get used to using nettles and so on. Sarah at Rowan and Sage has an entire monograph on nettles as part of her herbaria membership, so if you'd like to learn more about actually using nettles, then I do highly recommend joining herbaria and basically getting involved with Sarah's materials in general. So I do have a link in the show notes if you would like to join the membership, and there's so much really useful and valuable information from an incredibly experienced herbalist, so you can actually get started and feel like you know what you're doing. Now we're going to move on to magical nettles. Now Cornelius Agrippa believed that Mars ruled the nettle, which makes a lot of sense because if you think back to the Mars episode, he's the god of war and he's sort of associated with burny and proddy things and swords and knives and things like that. So I think a plant that stings you sort of comes under that quite nicely. Now you could actually carry nettle and milfoil to drive off both fear and evil spirits, and meanwhile you could also carry nettles in a pouch which would break curses and return them to the sender. And I do love the idea that that one actually contains a pouch, because obviously that would mean that you wouldn't then be stinging yourself, because I don't imagine that would ward off much. In the Tyrol in Austria, people try to ward off thunderstorms by casting nettles into the fire. Nettles did in this particular region have a link with Thor, so again that would make sense that you would be using a plant associated with Thor to try and stop him from causing a thunderstorm. And gathering nettles before dawn would apparently keep evil spirits away from their cattle. Fez Incrite recommends drying nettle stalks to use as incense, or indeed grind them into a powder to use in spells, particularly protective charms. In Wales, people might place a handful of nettles under a sick person's pillow, and the next day they would be checked. So green leaves indicated that the patient would recover, while brown leaves indicated that the patient would die. Nettles also appear in dream lore, which is quite an interesting departure for this podcast, because normally we're looking at love divination, so it's quite cool to see dreams popping up this time. And if you dreamt of being stung by nettles, it meant that you would be vexed and disappointed. And if you dreamt of gathering nettles, it meant someone thought well of you. And if you were married and had these dreams, then it also meant that you would have harmony among your family, which is quite an interesting thing to have, that you've got these plants that cause stings and really are quite painful, but dreaming of them actually brought good stuff, which I think is really interesting. Of course, we can't go any further talking about a plant without mentioning the Victorian language of flowers, and nettles meant slander. Now, it was unclear to me if that was slander about you or by you, but hopefully the recipient would hopefully have the context to understand which one it was, whether you were being accused of doing it or someone was warning you that there was slander about you. But basically, there's always contradictions in folklore, so despite all the benefits listed here, other people also called the nettle devil's apron because they believed that Satan protected himself with the plant. So what do we make of the folklore of nettles? Well, nettles are much like dandelions, incredibly useful and often really quite unwanted. I mean, obviously dandelions don't sting you, but boiling or blanching nettle leaves will remove the sting and then you can still enjoy the benefits of them. But it's interesting to see them used both to ward off evil or return curses and also considered as a plant of the devil, because it just goes to show that a baneful plant is also sometimes helpful against baneful influences, a little bit like people using witchy charms to ward off witches. And it's also a good reminder that the most useful plants often aren't the prettiest, the showiest, or indeed the most difficult to grow. Nettles are abundant, they offer a whole range of benefits, and they're an important part of any garden ecosystem. So unlike a lot of the poisonous plants on this blog, like yes, they'll hurt if you touch them, but they're not toxic like monkshood or deadly nightshade are. So if you do have any nettles in your garden and you don't have little ones to worry about, then you could always consider cultivating a little nettle patch, and you might even develop a taste for nettle soup. So let me know what you think about nettles. Have you, like I did, managed to fall headfirst into a patch of nettles? 0 out of 10 would not recommend. I mean, I was fine, but still it was really annoying. It was also really funny because when that happened, there was not a dock leaf in sight, because dock leaves are quite favoured by rabbits and the local rabbit population had decimated all of the dock leaves. So I never even got a chance to see if it worked or not. And I basically ended up having to go to the first aid point of the place where I was staying, and they didn't have anything for nettle stings, which seemed really odd. So I had to kind of fashion my own homemade remedy, which was rather odd. But yeah, so me and nettles have a bit of a weird relationship because of that. But feel free to tell me what you think of nettles. Let me know if you use nettles, if you drink nettle tea, if you eat nettle soup. There's all kinds of recipes for things you can make with nettles online, which is really interesting. And as I say, if you are interested in learning how to use it from a herbalism point of view, I really, really highly recommend the Herbaria membership, because there's so many really cool classes going on in there, and lots of monographs about plants, and just lots of really good information in general. So I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. I haven't decided what I'm doing next week. I'm thinking daisies might be quite a good one, because I know people really, really hate getting them in their lawn. I'm not 100% sure why. Or I might also look at thistles. Again, haven't quite decided. So obviously that'll be a bit of a surprise for you next week, which one I've decided to do. But without any further ado, I will let you go and do whatever it was you were doing before you started listening to this episode. Thank you very much for making it this far, and I will see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.